Like many of Plato's dialogues, Euthyphro takes its title from the person to whom Socrates is speaking. The phonetic spelling of the Greek name is in parentheses. Socrates meets Euthyphro on the steps of ancient Athens courthouse. The picture on the right is of the U.S. Supreme Court steps, but you get the idea. Before jumping into the dialogue, let's take a general look at ancient Greek and Roman philosophy for some context. It is helpful to think of ancient philosophy in three general time periods, with Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle in the middle. The pre-Socratics, as the name implies, lived before Socrates. There is very little known about these philosophers. Almost all the existing records consist of other philosophers, like Plato and Aristotle, referring to the pre-Socratics. 5th century Athens is sometimes referred to as the Golden Age of philosophy. Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle were three successive generations. Socrates was Plato's teacher, and Plato was Aristotle's teacher. While Socrates did not himself write anything, Plato's and Aristotle's works are extensive and have shaped all major areas in Western thought, from science to religion to politics. Plato wrote about 40 dialogues. Socrates is the main character in almost all of them. One of the reasons that Plato chose the dialogue form was to present Socrates as an exemplar of what it means to live a wise and good life. Aristotle, by contrast, wrote treatises. His goal was to organize all branches of knowledge into one general system. Aristotle's system remained the dominant paradigm for studying nature for more than 1,000 years, lasting well into the 1600s. The Greco-Roman schools, the third time period of ancient philosophy, built on specific parts of Plato's and Aristotle's philosophies. Of the ancient Greek philosophers, we will only be reading Plato and Aristotle. For those of you who are visual learners or just lovers of art, here is Raphael's famous Renaissance painting of Greek philosophy. Although it is commonly referred to as the School of Athens, the fresco depicts philosophers from all three of the previously mentioned time periods. At the center are Plato and Aristotle. Plato is pointing up, while Aristotle is pointing downwards. This represents Plato's emphasis on ideas and rational dialogue, in contrast to Aristotle's emphasis on observing nature. Socrates is a little to the left of Plato, no doubt stirring up some trouble. There are three main themes in this lecture, beginning with the dialogue format of Plato's writings. From there, we will examine the Euthyphro dialogue in particular, whose central topic is piety. Creative nonfiction is a writing genre that has only been recognized since the 1960s. The label might sound like an oxymoron, since creativity in writing is often associated with fiction. But the idea of the genre is that even when you stick to the facts, a story doesn't simply tell itself. In this general way, the label is helpful for understanding Plato's use of the dialogue format. Plato never speaks in the first person in any of his dialogues. Plato's writings are based on historical persons, most importantly Socrates. Plato did spend a significant amount of time learning from Socrates and wanted his character to reflect at least the spirit of the historical person. In this way, Plato's dialogues are works of nonfiction. But it would be wrong to think of the dialogues as a tape recording of Socrates' thoughts. For many of the dialogues, Plato is not present if the actual conversation between Socrates and his conversation partner even occurred. Even if the conversation occurred and Plato was present, he would be relying on fallible human memory, since there were no technologies to record conversations as they happened. This is why it's appropriate to think of Plato's dialogues as also creative works, rather than as a reporter who only records another person's thoughts. Back to the Euthyphro dialogue, Socrates usually hangs out around the marketplace, where all Athenians pass through. This is why Euthyphro is surprised to see Socrates at the courthouse steps. Euthyphro assumes correctly that Socrates is not there to prosecute someone. Notice how the dialogue format is thus able to implicitly tell us about the kinds of people each character is. Socrates has stayed away from the law courts and politics in general. When reading a dialogue, it is important to read between the lines. This enables you to understand the characters and the meaning of the situation. The character Euthyphro is a good example of this. Even though it isn't explicitly said, we know that Euthyphro is a friendly companion of Socrates from his greeting and Euthyphro's concern for Socrates. Euthyphro is a well-known priest. This is also more implied than explicitly stated. Euthyphro mentions that he speaks on divine matters in front of the Athenian assembly. Euthyphro is very confident in his own abilities. He claims that all of his prophecies have come true. Euthyphro's vanity is apparent from his concern with how the assembly has laughed at his prophecies. Given his fame, vanity, and self-confidence, Euthyphro sounds more like the leader of a megachurch than someone concerned with helping the poor. Euthyphro's self-confidence becomes even more evident when he explains that he is at the courts to prosecute his own father for murder. Before looking at Euthyphro's case against his father, some general background is needed. In modern society, no one would prosecute his or her family member. Even if you happen to work as a prosecutor, you would be required to withdraw yourself from a case involving anyone you have a close relationship, such as a family member. But it's still worth asking whether you would even volunteer information to investigators that would implicate a family member in a crime. Would you withhold the information even if you believed the family member was guilty? According to the modern ideal of impartiality, when it comes to matters of justice, you should not make exceptions for yourself or those close to you. This is why Lady Justice is depicted as blindfolded. The general idea is that if we don't know the identity of the individuals involved in a case, we will make a fair and just decision. We will judge the case solely on the evidence, not on who we want to win. Socrates often defends acting in this general manner, as we will see later in other dialogues, yet even Socrates is surprised that Euthyphro is prosecuting his own father. Let's now consider what exactly Euthyphro's father did. Euthyphro begins by noting the person his father killed was a dependent of his. Euthyphro then says that this victim had himself just killed a household servant in drunken anger. It was only after this first death that Euthyphro's father tied up this so-called victim and threw him in a ditch. Finally, Euthyphro's father sent someone to a priest in Athens in order to find out what should be done with the bound man. While the father waited, the bound man died of cold and hunger in the ditch. Even if you think the father was wrong to let the person die in the ditch, notice that we wouldn't consider this murder in a modern legal system. At most, it would be manslaughter. The father was justified in restraining someone who had just killed another person, and the father did not intend to kill the person. Instead, the death of the bound man happened by negligence. And even if you believe that Euthyphro's father deserves punishment, it is easy to understand why Euthyphro's family is opposed to the prosecution. They call Euthyphro's actions impious. As a famous priest, Euthyphro considers himself an expert on what piety is. This disagreement between Euthyphro and his family begins the heart of the dialogue. In the dialogue, Euthyphro offers three main definitions of piety. The first definition begins, "The pious is to do what I am doing now, to prosecute the wrongdoer." In response to his angry family, Euthyphro notes that Zeus bound his father because he unjustly swallowed his sons. Euthyphro's point is that Zeus punished his father when his father was acting unjustly. Socrates responds that he did not ask for examples of piety, but rather a definition of what piety is. In other words, rather than describing what Zeus did and what Euthyphro is doing, Socrates wants a definition that can cover all cases of piety. Euthyphro's second definition is an attempt to meet this challenge. Euthyphro says, "What is dear to the gods is pious, what is not is impious." By itself, Euthyphro's definition sounds fine, even if it's a little vague. But Socrates notes that Euthyphro has already given an example of the gods disagreeing with each other. Zeus and his father are both gods, and they battled each other. If the gods disagree with each other, then the gods might have conflicting views about what is pious. This means the second definition, at the very least, does not tell us enough to determine whether an action is or is not pious. Socrates' response highlights an important application of critical thinking skills. The biggest issue with the second definition is not that Euthyphro didn't know enough about the gods, but rather that Euthyphro holds conflicting beliefs. He has just told us the story of Zeus fighting his father, but didn't see how the story is at odds with his second definition of piety. Euthyphro is too focused on justifying his actions to see the contradiction. But Euthyphro is undeterred. He claims that regarding his own case, all of the gods would agree. This exchange leads up to what is now referred to as Euthyphro's paradox. Socrates draws attention to the paradox with the following question: is the pious being loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is being loved by the gods? Socrates is asking a really hard question. He wants to know the foundation of piety. The question poses a two-horned dilemma. In other words, you have two choices that both have important negatives. The first option is that the gods love the pious because it is pious. In other words, piety is a standard that exists independently of the gods. The drawback of this option is that it seems to limit the gods' powers. They have no control over what is pious. Your second option is that the gods choose what is pious. In other words, the gods love something, and as a result of their love, that thing becomes pious. The drawback of the second option is that it seems to make piety arbitrary. The gods can choose to have anything be pious, and so there is no in-principle reason why the gods would not choose something that we now consider bad. Euthyphro's paradox was a particularly troubling issue for later Christian theologians. Given how hard of a question it is, Euthyphro should not be faulted for having difficulty in answering it. But it is telling that Euthyphro is so confused by the question that Socrates has to rephrase it. Euthyphro is a priest, but he apparently has not considered the question before. This is another instance of Euthyphro's short-sightedness. It gets worse for Euthyphro when Socrates brings up the topic of justice. Socrates wants to know how piety and justice relate to each other. More specifically, Socrates wants to know whether all pious actions are also just, and vice versa. Euthyphro has been more concerned with justifying his actions in terms of piety, yet at this point he agrees with Socrates that justice includes all pious actions, but not vice versa. The Venn diagram on the right represents this claim. Notice that if justice includes all pious actions, but not the other way around, then presumably Euthyphro should be more concerned with the nature of justice than with piety. This issue becomes more clear with Euthyphro's third definition of piety. Euthyphro says that piety deals with caring for the gods, while justice deals with caring for other people. Euthyphro then attempts to explain what he means by caring for the gods. Euthyphro says that caring for the gods consists of actions that preserve both private houses and public affairs of state. There are two immediate issues with Euthyphro's third definition. The first issue is that, according to this definition, Euthyphro should be thinking about the nature of justice in order to understand how he should treat his father, since his father is a person, not a god. The second and more serious issue is that Euthyphro's actions are tearing his private house apart. Hence, by his own definition, his action is impious. This is another instance of Euthyphro failing to think through the implications of his beliefs. On the final page of the dialogue, Euthyphro offers one more attempt to define piety. This definition ultimately reduces down to, the pious is what is dear to the gods. Euthyphro is going in circles. It is clear that Euthyphro has not carefully thought about these matters, and if there is ever a time that you should have carefully thought through your actions, prosecuting a family member is one of them. Despite his obvious confusions, Euthyphro leaves the conversation in haste, presumably still planning to prosecute his father. Hence, the dialogue has an aporetic ending. The most important thing that has been learned is that Euthyphro does not know what piety is. While this is not something to get excited about, it is still useful. In more general terms, knowing what we don't know is helpful. We should not always expect to have answers, and it's very good to know when we don't have the answers. Similarly, philosophy is a method because it is much less about content than about the process of approaching tough problems. In the Apology, the next dialogue, Socrates applies the philosophical method to his accusers rather than to an overconfident friend.